upon the conversation.
Hello and welcome to the Kongversation. I'm Hyle Russell, and my guest today has been at Rare for 3.5 decades, having a direct hand in several of the games we've long obsessed over here at DK Vine. From programming Donkey Kong Land and It's Mr. Pants to masterminding Stop N Swop. He's now Director of Quality at Rare, overseeing the likes of Sea of Thieves and Everwild. It's an honor and privilege to welcome to the show, Paul J. Machacek.
Oh, I've never had the J before. Hyle, thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate that. J, there must be another Paul Machacek out there that you're trying to separate me away from there.
I don't want any confusion. It's like when they announce an assassin on TV, they always have to give the middle initial. So there's no confusion. No, thank you so much for being here. We've loosely talked back and forth on social media for probably half a decade now, but I've always wanted to have you on the podcast because every summer I tend to get very nostalgic, as one does when you recall, childhood summers long past. And a large part of my childhood, I have fond memories of playing Donkey Kong Land in the family car on long road trips, or in 1998, beak bombing everything in Banjo-Kazooie to try to figure out the mechanism that would free the ice key. And so, given that you've loomed so large, your works have loomed so large in summers past, I always think every time June rolls around, it'd really be nice to get Paul Machacek on the podcast. So I'm glad we could finally do this before summer is officially finished. And it's also just a matter of months before It's Mr. Pants' 20th anniversary.
Okay. Look, I mean, it's always been a team effort, and thank you for the childhood thing, because that doesn't age me at all. Mr. Pants, 20 years. Is it really? Yeah, it is. It is, isn't it? Wow. We actually, the very first version of that, I banged together in a few hours one day in 1999. So for me, it's 25 years old.
Oh, wow.
That's how far it goes back. But
I'm looking forward to really delving into that with you. But, not to age you anymore, because I'm feeling it too. I'm 40 this year. So, talking about my golden youth and then I rapidly withering upper back pain, and but I want to really set the stage because I said 3.5 decades. Has it been 35 years? Is that an accurate estimation?
It's where are we now? September. It's July. 36 years and a couple of months.
36 years. Okay. So you're one of the longest tenured employees at Rare, and
not one of.
You're now it. You've won.
I've been it for some time. I don't know if winning was a goal here. Some people might not regard it as a win, but yes, I have been the longest for some years now.
How did you get your start in the industry, and what exactly led you to Rare in the first place?
Well, I suppose I was a geek. My dad was. My dad was an electronics engineer. He designed electronic equipment, had some companies, and they built all sorts of stuff. And I was surrounded by electronics as a kid, and I got a soldering iron when I was 11. And I just really liked technical stuff. And then home computers came along. In the early 80s, we had ZX81s, Spectrums came. The Oric one I saved up my pocket money for. It was my first home computer. And I originally learned to code on it. And it was incredible back then. Your country and mine are a little different, but at the time I had this computer, we had 3 television channels in the UK, BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. And we had one TV at home. This was the early 80s, and I plugged this computer into the TV and mucked about with it for a while. And eventually I managed to put a dot on the screen using commands. It's like, wow, this thing that has always been a one-way medium, just sending us stuff through the air. I can now control it. The universe is mine. I did actually get access to computers before that because I was lucky. The school I was at, we had some fantastic machines by Research Machines. They were big black boxes, and we had probably about 8 of them spread across some desks. And they were connected on a very crude network to a single floppy drive that was shared. So I did actually start to learn BASIC in the very early 80s at school that way. And I just loved it. You know, the technical side of it was fantastic. I got really into learning to write computer software, initially through BASIC. But I wrote a game. It was a text sort of adventure game. Hey, you're in a room. There's a door on the left. There's a tree. There's a thing that's going to kill you. What do you want to do now? That kind of thing. It was called the Temple of Zagorsk, and I wrote it for a computer project at school. So I was in the computing class. We didn't really have proper computing classes in school back then. By the way, am I just rambling here? We didn't have proper computing classes back in school back then. There was one class. It was run by a maths master whose entire qualification for running the class was he was the only teacher at the school that actually had a home computer and knew how to switch it on. So he started teaching us. And there was myself and one other lad in the class that was really into this at home. And we thought we knew everything at the time, and we were just furiously coding away at home. So he hated us because we actually knew all the answers and would often correct him when he got it wrong in class, in front of all the other kids that were just trying to work out what a computer actually was. And it sort of went from there. You know, I just spent a lot of time hiding away in a bedroom at my parents' house, programming. And obviously, you know, when you learn to program, well, what are you going to write? And I have written tools and things, but generally speaking, we were all playing Defender and Space Invaders and Pac-Man and things back then. It's like, I want to write a video game. That sounds like a cool thing to do. So I started writing video games. And, you know, you kind of get to a point where you finish a game. What do you do then? And it was in an offline world. We had no internet back then, in the way that you folks know it today. And we would get monthly magazines come through, and software houses would be advertising their wares. But they'd also be saying, hey, if you've written a game, approach us. So I did. So, you know, I was at school. I'd written a game. I can't remember what order I wrote these games. So I had some early games. One was called Dark World. One was called Dawnslay. Another was called Pyramidia. And I approached various companies. I ended up signing contracts and doing deals, and they sent me checks through the post. And it's like, oh, what do I do with this? I'm a child and I don't have a bank account. So so I kind of worked it out, and I would occasionally disappear from home. But I was still at school. I was a child, right? So I would disappear from home and wander into London for the day. And my parents didn't quite know where I was, and I didn't quite tell them. What I was actually going to do was I was going to business meetings with business people, and they were putting contracts in front of me that I had to read and eventually sign. And then they were writing me checks I couldn't cash because I had no bank account because I was a child. Classic child labour, sort of in by the back door, I guess. And that's kind of how I got started.
Well, it brought you to Rare, obviously, and at Rare in the late 1980s and early 90s, you worked on several licensed games like WWF Superstars for the Game Boy and Beetlejuice for the NES before kind of planting on the Battletoads series for a while. And it was Battletoads for the Game Boy that you espoused your philosophy that a supporting handheld game should be an entirely new experience, not just the retread of the console title, which I love. I love that assertion. I love that you put your foot down, and I've always appreciated it. But how hard did you have to fight, like the Stampers or anyone else, for that to say, no, we're making an original Battletoads adventure?
To be honest with you, we've had a lot of fights over the years, but the Battletoads one was actually quite easy. So the original, Tim and Mark and Kev were working on the NES game, and at that time, and they were about halfway through production on it. I can't remember how long it took. It's probably about 6 to 8 months, I think, to write the NES game. And in the middle of that, I just finished. What was it? Oh, so Kev and I just finished WWF Superstars, and Tim said, "Look, do you want to do a port of the game we're working on right now?" And obviously, we had no idea where Battletoads was going. There was an intention to build a franchise, but when you're halfway through writing the first game, you've got no idea how people are going to receive it or whether it's going to be successful or not. But it looked fun, it looked interesting. And I simply said to him, look, well, I've got to write everything from scratch. There's virtually nothing I can carry over from WWF Superstars. It didn't even have an engine, that game. The screen hardly moved. There was a little bit of sideways scrolling for the wrestling ring. But effectively, apart from some key scanning software, I have to write everything absolutely from scratch. So why don't we just do a bit of extra design work, that famous, just a bit of extra design work, and write a new game to go alongside the NES one, because otherwise people have bought the NES one, aren't going to buy a Game Boy one, are they? And, the conversation lasted a matter of minutes, and Tim just nodded and went, yeah, okay, fine, I'll go with that. And it didn't go horribly wrong, except it did eventually, because so the first Battletoad game on the Game Boy, we simply called it Battletoads. We just didn't have a reason not to call it Battletoads.
Right.
But we hadn't thought that we'd just given it the same name as the NES one. So about 3 years later, 2 or 3 years later, when we did finally port the NES one, we had a slight problem with the title because we'd already used it. So when we did the NES one on Game Boy in, I don't know, 93 or early 94, 93 probably, we had to call it Battletoads in Ragnarok's World, because we basically just screwed up the marketing on that. Sorry, folks, for the confusion.
I think you worked on Battletoads Double Dragon, right?
So yeah, I coded 4 Battletoad games on the Game Boy. Double Dragon was the second one I think I did. That was obviously very closely related to, because we did that on console as well.
Right. I think that was the first game you worked on that I ever personally played. Not that I knew it at the time. It was just my friend had it. I played it, and it's like, oh, okay, that's enjoyable. But the game that really clicked with me was Donkey Kong Land, obviously. You were the lead programmer for Donkey Kong Land, which was announced at the 1994 Summer Consumer Electronics Show, which I had only just learned about in the last month or two. I had been doing research on the 94 CES, and I had no idea that Donkey Kong Land was announced that early, like concurrently with Donkey Kong Country. When was the project conceived relative to Donkey Kong Country?
The work on DKC, I mean, we originally got our first SGI machine. It was either late 1990 or early 1991. And Tim and Kev started trying to work out how to use the rendering tech on that to create artwork for, the NES was the main console people played with at the time. And, possibly a view to doing that on the Game Boy as well. And so what led into Donkey Kong happened over a period of about 3 years. It sort of built up. The main team on that game was probably working on it about 18 months or something. And obviously we released it for Christmas. Sorry, Donkey Kong Country. We released that for Christmas 94. It was late. It was just coming in so hot it couldn't be finished. And I believe that Nintendo built a cartridge manufacturing plant in New Mexico, I think, to save about 6 weeks of cartridge travel time from the Far East, so that the team at Rare had extra time to finish the game, but for it to get out for Christmas for its key market of America, right? So they were working on that most of the way through 1993, and obviously virtually all of 94 until they finally shipped the final build. Tim came to me in the summer of 94, so a few months before they finished it, and said, "Hey, Paul, do you want to port DKC onto Game Boy?" And I went, "No. Do you remember that Battletoads discussion we had? I've got to write everything from scratch." Actually, that wasn't quite true, because I started I started with the engine from the fourth Battletoad game and spent 3 weeks heavily modifying that, and that became the engine for DKL. But I said, look, I've got to start virtually from scratch. for a bit of extra design work. And Tim went with it, actually. I guess it hadn't blown up horribly when we did it on Battletoads. So he was okay. He was quite chilled. Again, it was a 5-minute conversation, and he was quite chilled. He went, yeah, all right, let's do that. So we ended up designing a complete new game to go alongside DKC. But so we were working on that, and had already made that decision a few months before we shipped the final build to DKC. And we started off, as we did with Battletoads, the first level of Donkey Kong Land has strong elements of the first level of DKC in it, so that you're in familiar territory. It's a new level. We designed it from scratch, but similar artwork, similar gameplay, all that kind of thing. And then we just went off on one and started designing more and more out there stuff and adding new characters and things. I can't quite remember, but obviously after DKC finished, they went straight onto DKC 2. And it took about a year, so summer of 94 to the summer of 95. I think I shipped it in June 95. Mm-hmm. The latter half of the DKL production overlapped the early parts of DKC2 production, and there were things going on that team, maybe the odd character being developed for their game that we nicked, and we got up to a team of about 15 people on DKL, so we were creating new content, new characters and things like that, some of which has been seen in bits of marketing materials or maybe the odd magazine article that didn't actually make the final game because, cutting room floor, that sort of thing happens in games like it does in films. But with the lead times on PR materials, sometimes stuff goes in and then we don't use it. And people come to us later and say, where was that creature that we saw in that magazine article? And it's like, yeah, it was in the game for 5 minutes and then we got rid of it again. Sorry.
Yeah. You have no idea, though, like the legend that is created in fans' minds when they see these characters, these renders in magazines. And obviously there's the baby Ram from Donkey Kong Land. Rambunctious is what Nintendo Power labeled it has. I have no idea if that's his actual name, but that was supposed to be like a rideable animal friend, right?
Probably. I'll be honest with you right now. My mind has drawn a blank. It was such a long time ago. That's why I still can't say. It was 30 years ago, dude. I just cannot remember.
Oh, I know. Like it's obviously the people who are receptive to your work, we're going to internalize it and obsess over it far more than you are, considering it's a project you work on. You might have affection and love and pride in it, but then you move on to the next thing. Meanwhile, we're sitting here saying there was a Kong wearing a hat that appeared in magazine articles for Donkey Kong Land. Who is that Kong wearing a hat? We have to know more answers, and you don't know anymore. I get it, but
well, I should point out one other thing as well. We were going through a heavy transitionary period at that time. I was out in Norway at Retromester a few weeks ago with Kev Bayliss and Heather Stevens, as she is now, Heather Gibson back in the day. Who worked on some of my early titles. And in those days, those folks, those artists, they were drawing artwork on tracing paper with big marker pens, and they were drawing dots, 1 pixel at a time. And then things were being boxed up with little 8x8 pixel boxes in pencil on there. And then somebody else would take this and convert that into hex numbers. And that's what would go into the game as artwork. And at that time, some members of the studio were learning how to use the rendering technology, okay, and trying to get these SGI machines to produce artwork and then find a way to convert that artwork so that it could be used down at the resolution and within the color palettes that the hardware, the consoles or the Game Boy that we were working on provided. So on DKL, by the time we got to that, some of the people on the team had never used rendering tech before. They were still in the dotty on tracing paper world, or we did actually have an in-house graphics editor, which I wrote, which worked on a modified version of our arcade board, the Rasboard hardware. And actually, it was funny. The other week, Heather showed me a screenshot of it, and I hadn't seen this thing in, I don't know, well over 30 years. And it brought back memories. But people were used to either drawing on tracing paper or starting to draw on the screen. And suddenly they had to move to modeling on SGI machines and building characters in 3D space on a 2D screen. These are hard techniques to learn, but to do it on the job when you're actually part of a game team that's trying to produce a commercial product in a sensible period of time and not work stupid hours and blow your budget. That's the hard thing to do. So what was happening was some of the artists on the team, they were creating characters and models which sometimes weren't used in the game because they were just learning how to do it. And every now and again, I remember one, Rambi, it was a goat with big horns, big sort of curly horns. And I remember who did that, and she did a fantastic job. And I think she did it as a test just to see if she could. And I loved it so much. It's like, we're using that one. That's great. Now you've got to animate it. It's like, I don't know how to animate, she said. And so she had to go and learn how to animate this model she built. And it was brilliant. I loved it. It was a great character. So.
Well, while we're talking about characters, you probably don't remember, but of course there are flying pigs in Donkey Kong Land, brilliantly named Hogwash, which I just love. But I've always assumed that was a joke, a nod to how impossible it seemed to do these pre-rendered graphics on the original Game Boy. Was that the idea behind them, or was it? What was it? Just a goofy character, and there's no greater meaning behind it.
So the flying pigs. Actually, there's two parts to this question. What you started with flying pigs, but you also talk about how difficult it is to get the rendered artwork onto a Game Boy. I'll tell you what. I'm going to leave you folks in suspense for about 60 seconds on the flying pigs one. In terms of the artwork, this is really funny, right? So a strong part of what Tim and Kevin, one or two other people did with the SGI machines, once they worked out how to model stuff on those systems, is a strong part of what they needed to do was render the frames out, but then find a way to shrink them down to the resolution. Because we're talking about really high resolution systems that could render in a huge number of colors. And then we're looking at a Super NES that has what would today be seen as a very low resolution and color palettes and a limited number of colors. And how do you do that conversion? It was that conversion stage that was the tricky thing to do. And Kev and Tim had to put a ton of time into getting just right. The funny thing is, once they'd done that, the problem was kind of solved if we then wanted to put those frames onto another similar system. And the Game Boy, in many ways, was a similar system. You could say, well, hang on a sec, that's not a full console. You put it in your pocket, it runs on batteries. It's got this laggy little green-grey screen, right? Yeah, okay, but it's got a limited number of pixels. It's got limited resolution. It does actually have palettes. It's got two. There aren't many colors. There are 4 shades of greeny-grey. And there were things you could do by dynamically altering the color layouts in a palette to make things flash on the screen. But Tim and Kev had actually done the donkey work, no pun intended, of converting these high resolution images down to something that would work on a low resolution console with limited colors. It wasn't much of a step beyond that at that point. Okay. Whilst we did this alongside our rendering work on the Super NES, the Game Boy technically is equivalent in capability, apart from some colors, to the NES. So we kind of effectively did a Donkey Kong game on NES level hardware, and was a lot of hard work and was amazing. As for the flying pigs, as you know, I'm a bit of a Pink Floyd fan, and they have flying pigs in their iconography. And we went to a Floyd-related concert last year, and there's inflatable radio-controlled pigs flying around in the arena while we're there. So they still do that stuff today.
So talking about the communication between the Donkey Kong Country team, because as you said, Donkey Kong Land's development intersected both the original game and then Donkey Kong Country 2. And you talked a little bit about nicking some things. I think the boss in the first world is vaguely the Stingray from Donkey Kong Country 2, but I've always loved how, for example, Donkey Kong Land gives you a few of the levels on the Gangplank Galleon ship in its first world, but not too much, it's almost like an appetizer to Donkey Kong Country 2. Were there those considerations being made or those discussions being had with the country team?
Some members of the country team, Tim Stamper, Greg Rails were looking at what we were doing. They were familiar. We were getting feedback at times. One of the things, there are certain styles of gameplay. You'd come up with a minecart level, or just the first level, it's a straight left to right scroller with platforms and collect some bananas and ride Ramby or whatever. There'll be certain styles of gameplay where the first time you put the level in, you have got to hard code a load of stuff. If you then do another level a bit like that, you've kind of got the code working. You just got to lay out a level again, maybe add some new assets, and then work out what the extra things you're going to add to this level to make it more interesting or challenging compared with the earlier version of that. And so, because Donkey Kong Country already had a head start, it had been in production for months before we started. And because I was having to hard code a lot of stuff from scratch. So one of the things that was happening is we would look at DKC in production and say, right, we haven't got a minecart level yet, or we haven't got this type of level or that type of level. And to get that off the ground, that would start with me having to code a load of stuff so that we could get the basics of that type of level or gameplay mechanic working. At the same time, we've got a team of 15 people eventually, and those people are relying on me to hurry up. They might feel like they've got nothing to do for a bit. So what we would do is we would take some of the assets from that type of level of DKC, and I would lay out a very rough, simple version of a level using the existing DKC assets, just so that I've got something to then hard code on top of and get working in terms of, platform collisions, how the thing is going to work. On the sailing ships where you're climbing the rigging, that was a whole other bit of coding for transversing that type of background compared with running along horizontal scrolling platforms on the first level, for instance. So what we would often do is we would take assets from the first rank, from DKC, set up a test level. I'd code a load of stuff to get you to be able to move around and navigate that space in a similar way. And we would build a level out of that. It would then be later in the game, if there was another similar type of level, of a Mark II, we would then do something much more bespoke, because I've already got the systems in place in the background to drive it. So we would add assets, change the artwork, do all sorts of other things at that point. So we would often have bits that were closely related to the first game. Plus, it's kind of good for the players, because if you played the Super NES game and then you come to ours, the first time you're confronted with something new, it's like, oh, I've got a bit of familiarity there. I've already played something like that over there. So you play that, and then we develop some more levels that are offshoots of that, and we sort of take you forward in perhaps a different direction from how DKC did.
Yeah, as a kid, it always just seemed like a brilliant master plan. Everything Rare did seemed like it was just this hugely coordinated effort, from the way Donkey Kong Land led to Donkey Kong Country 2, or, even Diddy Kong Racing debuting, Banjo and Conquer. It just seemed like, they've got a 20-year scheme here to really get their hooks in us. And, but of course the answer is never that clean or simple. But yeah, it was really brilliant, because one of my biggest complaints about the original Donkey Kong Country was you see that ship sailing in throughout, it gets closer and closer, and you're like, I can't wait to explore that pirate ship. And then you get there and it's just the final boss fight, and you're left a little bit deflated. So then for Donkey Kong Land to come out 7-8 months later and actually let us have a few stages on there before Donkey Kong Country 2, dedicated its entire first world, I just thought that was a wonderful drip feed of the concept.
I desperately don't want to undermine your podcast by telling you that everything wasn't planned and there wasn't a deep meaning and a universe put in place back in the 80s that we finally delivered over a long period of time. And some of the things that you mentioned, it's really funny. I mean, we've had questions over the years about, why did you make a game around Banjo, which was just this obscure character from Diddy Kong Racing? No, we released the games in the wrong order. The first time people saw Banjo, and I think Conquer as well, was in Diddy Kong. Was Conquer in Diddy Kong Racing?
Yes.
I think it was. Yeah. Or an early version of Conquer. So Diddy Kong Racing wasn't supposed to come out then. Banjo was supposed to come out then. Banjo was Nintendo's Christmas hit for 1997, and then we screwed up and shipped it the following summer. We just couldn't get it done. We absolutely couldn't get it done in time. And quite late in the year, Nintendo came to us and said, we don't like you anymore. You're bad people. What are we going to do with our tech? Because all this stuff for Christmas was sorted out back in March. Or the production of cartridges, the marketing, shipping, all of the retail channels, everything for holidays is sorting out back in sort of March, April time. We were number one. They had a $10 million advertising budget for Banjo, and we just couldn't finish it. So they came to us and they said, right, what are you going to do now? We've got a big $10 million hole and we don't have Christmas number one. It's Rare's fault. Yeah, okay, we get that. And so they were re-shown DKR, which had these characters in. The DKR team did a fantastic job. Obviously, that's been a brilliant game. It's very, very popular. I even did production when we came back to it about a decade later. We put it out on the DS, the Nintendo DS, around about 2007. And it was a hugely successful game at the time. Nintendo had already seen it. They already knew we were doing it. But in the end, out of probably desperation, they just went, all right, we'll sell DKR instead. In the end, DKR sold more copies because they came out in Christmas '94 with that marketing budget than Banjo did. I think it sold 2 million more copies than Banjo did the following summer. So good on them, lucky them. But, we didn't make a game out of one of their obscure characters. We screwed up our production, and they came out first and showed our character before the rest of the world saw it properly in our game. So there we go. No master plan. We were just making it up by the seat of our pants.
All together now.
You didn't directly work on Donkey Kong Land 2 and Land 3. I believe Robert Harrison took over programming on the former, and was it Ian Manders on the third one?
Yeah, Ian did the third one. I didn't really have anything to do with the second one. I handed over software from the first game, and Rob went and wrote a great game. On the third one, Ian was quite new in the industry. Rob had been around for a while. He'd worked in Killer Instinct and things like that. Ian was fairly new in the industry at the time, and I had some involvement helping out towards the end of that. Not in a programming way or anything, just sort of advice, helping ship that game, push it out the door, that kind of thing. But, Rob and Ian did fantastic jobs on both of those sequels.
Not to take away what they did, but I've always been curious, given, your philosophy on handheld games, counterparts to the console games, what direction would you have taken Donkey Kong Land 2 in had you been able to have a crack at it?
Oh, I don't really know, because I didn't.
Right.
So here's the thing. What you don't do is you don't sit in the office and say, right, we're just finished here, what we're doing next, and then work it all out in 5 minutes. So I can't really give you that answer in less than 5 minutes here. I don't really know. I mean, obviously, those games went into production straight after, I shipped DKL. Just as alongside that in another building in Twycross, the 3 DKC games went consecutively. So the teams would morph over time. But the 3 DKC games were done consecutively, and so were the DKL ones. And things were being nicked off each other a little bit over that time. Certainly, with the second and third DKC games, Kev and other people were saying, right, we need more characters. We need to expand this out. And you got Diddy Kong and Cranky Kong and all the other Kongs coming in at that point as a way to sort of bulk the games up. And Rare wants to create new characters. We obviously had to give them back to Nintendo 21 years ago. But Rare likes creating characters. So Donkey Kong came to us from a platformer and ended up with a whole family of people as a result of work that Rare did in that time. And the handheld teams were taking those cues. Other characters went in. I think Dixie Kong went into DKL 3 off the top of my head. Sorry, I haven't played it recently, so I'm desperately trying to remember what characters were in what games. But people on both threads of activity, whether it was the the DKC series, the DKL series, were talking to some extent, and some assets were being shared, and certainly as the Kong family was growing out, and you could start swapping between Kongs live within the game, some elements of that moved to Game Boy. At the same time, we have restrictions on Game Boy. It's a smaller resolution screen. In fact, a reason, I flippantly said at the start, why we did DKL differently from DKC, that I just thought, let's write a new game. But actually, there were some practical considerations. DKC is a game that flows. So, if you start a level and start moving at a certain pace, everything is set up so that you can just fly through the level. And things start to get a bit awkward if you slow down and stop or pause or hesitate. And things are laid out very, very carefully for that to work. Okay. And there would certainly be times when you're playing DKC on a normal television where just as you're coming off something at one side of the screen, other things would just be coming on the screen at the other side. And you just get a flavor of, right, that's where I need to get to. And you sort of smoothly collect some bananas and end up in another barrel that spins you around, and the screen suddenly scrolls and you can just see the target of where that barrel is going to throw you for the next part. The problem was that the Game Boy was physically lower resolution screen. And so the way that things were laid out on DKC wouldn't have worked nicely on a Game Boy. You wouldn't have got some of the warnings about what was coming up next, what was going to happen next. And it would have just been a much harder thing to play. So by designing new levels, we were accounting for the lower resolution, the narrower width of the Game Boy screen compared with looking at a Super NES on a cathode ray tube television. And we were able to give the same flavor of gameplay, but aligned to the screen limitations that we had there. Also bearing in mind that things were less clear on a Game Boy, things were slow and blurry, which wouldn't give you the crispness of visual feedback that you would get on a TV playing DKC. And so we deliberately designed the timings and the layouts of the levels so that you could play the game in a similar fashion to DKC, but within the confines of a Game Boy screen. And when I came off that, after we shipped the first game, when Rob was doing the second game, when Ian was doing the third game, they encountered, that they had the same limitations that I did. And so taking flavors and direction from the DKC games, but designing new games, or redesigning some experiences to fit within the confines of the Game Boy was an important part of what they had to do.
Yeah, Rare actually did then port the original Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy Color in 2000, which had to account for everything you just said. The lack of screen real estate, and
well, it was high resolution. You finally had some colors, and it was less laggy than it was. So the disparity between looking at a Super NES screen on a conventional television and looking at the Game Boy Color screen was somewhat less. So you could get away with doing a much more direct port, which is what we ended up doing. Yeah.
Yeah, twice then, actually. But help me fill in the gaps between the release of Donkey Kong Land and Banjo-Kazooie. Did you move over directly to Project Dream once Donkey Kong Land was shipped?
Yes. So as soon as that was out the way, Project Dream, can't remember exactly, had approximately about 18 people on it. And I joined that at the time. I've over the one of the things I do at Rare is I sort of tell war stories. When things aren't going well, I say, "Hey, this is nowhere near as bad as that thing we did 35 years ago." And here's the war story. Now you lot can cheer up because you're having a better day than we did. And I often use Banjo and the Dream thing because very good examples of the difference that just having the right idea and better project management can have on a title. The really high level view here is that we were on. So there were two versions of Dream actually. The initial version of Dream was on the Super NES, right at the end of that console's life cycle. I wasn't on that. The folks that did the work on that, and they came out with a small but incredibly incredibly amazing demo. They just did a fantastic job on it. But realistically, creating a demo that absolutely stretched the hardware to the end of its capabilities is not the same as writing a game. And doing it right at the end of the console's life cycle, where already DKC, which came out a couple of years earlier, was seen as having extended that console's life cycle already. We weren't going to go anywhere with that. So everybody moved to the N64. I joined the team at that time, and Dream 2 was born. And we were on that for 16 months, and we basically didn't do anything useful. Except create the Banjo character. We wrote loads of editors. We had a space. We had loads of editors in there. You could place all sorts of objects down. I wrote a tree editor where you could place a tree down, and so we had a handful of different tree assets, and they were all sprite-like. They were flat to camera. So as you moved around, they would just stay flat to camera because that's all the hardware could. That's all we could do with the hardware at that time. And what you could do is you could take this tree asset and you could stretch it vertically, stretch it horizontally, slightly change its shade of green. That was about it. So we put this editor in, and then somebody went and edited 5,000 slightly different versions of the same tree down. We're all looking at it going, wow, that's incredible. There's no gameplay, though. We just walk past all these trees going, there's a lot of trees there. What are we actually doing here? And it was a bit like that for 16 months. And we actually restarted the project 4 times. There were like 4 attempts to, right, okay, guys, we've got nowhere. Let's start again. And then we just carried on putting more trees in. And we had some pretty fruit that were floated in the air that you could collect. And we had some big numbers on the screen, which I remember putting in for sort of a high score thing. It would tell you how many fruit you'd collected. And there was no gameplay. You just wandered around collecting fruit and looking at all the amazing variations of this tree asset that we had. And then on the 4th restart meeting, we're 16 months in, folks. We've got nowhere. We literally have no game. There's nothing here. We walk around and we look at our trees and collect our fruit, and there's nothing here apart from that. And what happened was the team was shrunk slightly. About 3 or 4 people left. We got down to about 14, 15 people. And we had a big meeting in the farmhouse. Everybody was sat around a table. Tim stood up and basically said, right, we've got an idea. We're going to go and do something else. We're going to take the bear with us. It's a hard slog. We're effectively starting again. We're restarting properly this time. And who's in? And he went round the table and he looked at each person sitting there at the table, and you just said yes or no at that point. And we all knew what it meant. We were going to be working very, very hard, let's put it that way, for an indefinite period of time from day one on that project. And everybody was in. Nobody said no. Nobody hesitated. Everybody was in. You know, I remember looking around the room, and there was a bunch of really great people in that room. Okay, probably half the team already had experience. Other people were newer to the industry, but they were great people. And I just remember saying, look, I just want to work with great people. So yeah, I'm in. Let's go for it. And 16 months later, we shipped Banjo. And we did 16 months of mucking about with trees and fruit on Dream 2. And then 16 months produced Banjo, which people didn't hate. They seem to like it today, apparently.
Yeah, a little bit.
And the funny thing was, within a week of that meeting, we already had a level on the background. It was empty. There were no assets in it, really, to speak of. But we had a level on the background that you would recognize as Spiral Mountain today. And Banjo was wandering around, and we had a tree asset there. And you'd run around the tree and go, "Ooh, isn't this pretty? What are we going to do now?" And then we started putting huts and cows and things in, and it happened very quickly. And it was basically a major subset of the people that worked on Dream 2. It was the same. It was effectively the same team, just with a decent set of ideas at that point, and we just flew through it. And it was brilliant. It was brilliant, and definitely something that went into that game. People see. I've spoken about it. I know Grant has. I think Greg has as well. Is that game was a direct function of that group of people on that team for those 16 months that we actually worked on Banjo. And you can see it in the game. You know, there's references to team members. The Jinjos are just Ed Bryan, basically. You know, we had one Jinjo in there, which was ginger, orange coloured, you know. And then obviously the idea, hey, we haven't got enough things to collect. Let's just have more. What do we do? Oh, let's just make some more colours with the Jinjos. Great. That will set the world on fire. So we've got lots of multicolored gingers in there, but it's just Ed Bryan. He's in the game. Lucky him.
Well, the aspect of Banjo-Kazooie, and I'm sorry I have to bring this up, but it has to come up. People will be wondering why I didn't bring it up. The aspect of Banjo-Kazooie that you are most publicly, personally associated with.
Shamed.
You are, in fact, the architect of, is the infamous Stop N Swop feature. Now, this is where the majority of people interviewing you on a rinky-dink podcast like this would probably park most of their time. I kind of want to gloss over it, but because you've been extraordinarily forthcoming with the details of Stop N Swop, at least what you can recall from 3 decades in the past. And Steve McCorkle from Rare Gamer, he and I have done 4 episodes on Stop N Swop in recent years, all based on your own revelations. So, if you want to learn more about Stop N Swop, if you're listening to this, I recommend going back and listening to that. It's well-worn territory at this point, but I want to waste your time just a little bit on it because, the childhood version of me, the one who spent the entirety of the summer of 1998 chasing every conspiracy theory, like every shadow, trying to figure out the secrets of the ice key and the eggs, at least the secrets on the Banjo-Kazooie side, what we knew at the time. I've said before on our correspondences on social media that for a very specific generation of Nintendo kid, Stop N Swop was kind of our cultural version of the Beatles' Paul is Dead rumor, where you're looking for clues, you're looking for like every little like tantalizing bit, you're playing the game backwards, and it's fitting. It's so apropos that the person responsible for this one is another Paul Macca, which I love the poetry of. Where were you coming up with Stop N Swop? Because you've explained how you came up with it, but you got everybody on board. Like the ice key, the eggs, the sandcastle codes, some of the dialogue, the menu, it's all in the game. And, you can even see the ice key during normal gameplay. The game's ending is just a full-throated showcase and tease for it. So you got everybody on board with it. How did you pitch it to them?
Okay, so first of all, a bit flattered about the Paul McCartney comparison there. I have to say, there's a gulf between me and Mr. McCartney in a bunch of ways. So, yeah, okay. Did we really screw with a generation of minds back then?
You did. You completely did. I have not ever matured into a fully functioning adult as a result of never actually obtaining the ice key properly. So
wow. Well, all I can say to that, Hyle, is you're absolutely welcome, baby. And anytime, if I could do it again, just to give you another second career, I'm happy to go and think up some mad shit tomorrow. So yeah, look, Rare always push the boundaries. We've been known for a bunch of stuff over the years, and in the early days, we were known to push the hardware hard. Okay, it wasn't just us. Other programmers, we didn't have software engineers back in the 80s and early 90s. It was computer programmers, often self-taught or uni dropouts. So, we were always trying to do things that were clever. If we could find a way to persuade an audio chip or a graphic chip to do something that wasn't publicized, but the output of that, as far as people could see or hear, was just something they hadn't experienced before. Yeah, we were game for that. I actually remember when the original Battletoads game was in production. By the way, my answers, by the time I get to the end of them, I completely forget the questions. You just set me off and I rambled for 5 minutes, right? So sorry about that.
That's the secret to podcasting. There's just no master plan. You just bumble your way through it and then the time's up.
Okay, all right. So when Mark and Tim took a half-written Battletoads on the NES to what would have been the Consumer Electronics Show, forget which one, summer one, the winter one, whichever one. I remember they came back, and this was, again, early 90s, offline world. They came back and they said it was really funny because people didn't believe that that game was standard NES hardware. So they said that some people were asking them if there was actually a new console inside the NES plastic casing that they were showing the game on, or whether there were extra chips in the cartridge, because they'd come up with a technique. Mark had come up with a technique, which is actually incredibly simple, and I did it on the Game Boy as well, which gives you an idea of parallax scrolling, where it looks like there's another layer of something going on behind, scrolling in parallax to the main level that you're on. And we used to do stuff all the time, and we would just push the hardware. Super Off-Road wouldn't run on Japanese hardware because I did some weird tricky stuff with the color palettes, and it ran fine on the American hardware. And then I was told it would never be released in Japan, and then they decided to try and release it in Japan after I'd written it, and I had to tell them that won't run on Japanese hardware because I did some stupid stuff to it. So by the time we got to this, you've heard the story. Tim approached me and said, "Look, Ian and Greg, I think it would be really cool if we could send codes between two games, and specifically have the two games there. They don't want codes that can be printed in magazines. They don't want codes that people could write down on bits of paper or spread by word of mouth. They want people to physically have two of our game cartridges right there in front of them." They wanted people to buy our games. Surprisingly enough, we are in business of trying to sell games here. So that was the starting point. So Tim said to me, "Look, is there any way that we could send a code that can't be shared any other way from one game to another?" Now, the thing was that you've heard the story and how I've described it. There had been an effect that we had all seen on home computers. You can see on Spectrums and Amstrad CPCs and Oryx and Commodore 64s, where if you switch them off and on, there'd be a brief residual image of what was on the screen just for a moment. There were reasons for that. But I'd always found it, and the image would be degraded. I mean, you had cut the power right, but the fact that enough of an image was still on the screen that you could still sort of see the structure of it or recognize what it had been, I found was amazing. And look, I'd had it at the back of my mind for probably 15 years by the time Tim and I were having this conversation. I'd never had any reason to go and investigate it, you know. And then he gave me a reason. And as soon as he asked me the question, I went, "Oh, I'll investigate that." And later that day, I'd written some test software to see how quickly RAM forgot data when you cut the power to it. And I came back with some surprising results. Now, Tim's a great artist, and he's a great designer. And if you spend time working with him, you'll realize he is constantly coming up with stuff, some of which is brilliant, some of it doesn't fly. But he's been a fantastic driver for, just look at the back catalogue, right? Stuff that he's worked on. And this could easily have been one of those things where something was chucked out there and it didn't come to anything. We just moved on. But I accidentally came up with a solution within hours. I mean, literally, he asked me early one afternoon, and I had a demo of it running with interesting results early that evening. And I got Tim and Greg to come to my desk, and I said, "You know that thing that Spectrums do when you switch them off and on, and you see a flash on the screen?" And they go, "Yeah." I went, "Well, that's kind of what I'm looking at here." And then I explained to them what the demo was, and we started swapping cartridges around. And what we found was that within a surprisingly long period of time, we could reliably send packets of heavily error-checked data from one cartridge to the other and back again. As soon as Tim saw that, he didn't need to ask any questions about, "Paul, is that really a dumbass idea? I mean, you're cutting the power." He wasn't interested in that. He simply saw an effect of me looking at him seriously, going, "Hey, this looks cool. It works in front of us." So Tim was off for one, and he took on a life of his own. There was no element of persuasion beyond that point.
It definitely left an impression on, like I said, I don't even know, because it's 98, the Rare website would have launched a couple months before Banjo-Tooie came out. But this was, you talk about a different world. I mean, the internet was starting to enter everybody's homes, but there was no social media. So there was still this divide, this wall up between the creators and the fans buying the games. And were you aware of the fervor you were causing, across the world from Stop N Swop? Or we didn't even know Stop N Swop at the time. We just knew there are these items in the game. Through the Rare website, through Lee Loveday, did you have any inkling how much of a panic you were causing?
completely oblivious to it.
Probably for
Didn't
the
have a
best.
clue. I mean,
Yeah.
the funny thing was, apart from anything else, we didn't regard Stop and Swap had been released because it required a second game to go out
Mm-hmm.
and for us to then start talking about it, or maybe not. Maybe we just let people discover it. Okay. So when Banjo went out, yes, there was an ice key and some eggs, and some messaging, but we hadn't actually released the feature at that point. It was something that there were visible assets, but nothing was functional. And it was, it was only when we were working on the next game that was going to have it in, which turned out to be DK64. If that had come out with Stop and Swap fully enabled, I suspect at that point we would then have had more visible reaction to how people view this. The magazines would have been printing stories about it. Hey, look at this incredible technology Rare has put into their game. You've got to go and do this. Go and buy both the Rare games. It's brilliant. And then, of course, we would have released Tooie. And, we had a plan. People keep asking me. Every time I answer this question, I give them a different set of 6 games because I can't quite remember which ones they were supposed to be. So Diddy Kong Racing had already shipped before Banjo shipped. So that was definitely not one of them. GoldenEye was already out, so it wasn't that. I'm pretty sure that we were talking about, obviously DK64 was the second one. We knew we were going to do a sequel to Banjo, so Tooie was definitely going to be there as well. Conker was in production at the same time that DK64 and Banjo was, and we were all trying to write the same game briefly for a while until we started to diversify, and eventually Chris Eva brilliantly diversified in a way no one else was going to with Conker. But I can't remember what other games. I suspect Perfect Dark would have ended up being on the list because just the time frame it was being written in, and we would have found a way to work it out. But we had no feedback. There was nothing there. If we had released the second game, if we had released the third game, released the fourth game, released the sixth game, and the super extra thing would have gone back to Banjo, whatever the hell that would have been. Yes, obviously there would have been publicity. We would have had all sorts of articles printed about us. That was the main level of feedback back then. It would have been interesting as well, to see the sales on that. Are people buying the full set of 6 games? I don't know what we would have compared that to because we wouldn't have known how the games would have sold otherwise. Right. But it was a clever idea, and I don't know if I've said this before. Actually, our purpose at Rare is to provide entertainment for people. Apparently, we did with a feature we never properly shipped. So good on us.
All right. It just felt like something magical because, this was even a couple months before Pokemon launched in the West. So the idea of 2 games readily communicating between each other, trading things, it just seems so alien and otherworldly. And it just felt like you were doing some sort of bizarre alchemy at Rare. Like we had no idea what Stop and Swap was going to be, but it was just the notion itself was enough to tantalize us. So I will always be grateful for the experience, if not the actual resolution.
I actually just want to add to this. I've heard all sorts of things over the years, and there's been lots of things said that weren't true. First of all, every time I read an article or a post where somebody says this was a bug in the hardware, it wasn't a bug in the hardware. It's just how RAM worked. Okay, let's get that right, folks. In fact, I love the bug in the hardware bit because we created this in 1998 from something I had witnessed in the early 1980s. A good 15 years of hardware had gone through where things that I had seen could be exploited a decade and a half after I'd originally seen them. Okay. But on that basis, and knowing what I know about how it works and what you need to be able to do to actually run it on a piece of hardware, whilst I've never tried it, I'm pretty certain that if Tim had asked me that question a few years earlier, we could have done Stop and Swap on the Game Boy, on the Super NES, or even the NES.
Wow.
Because there's no reason that I can think of right now that we couldn't have just switched those machines on. They would have held data for periods of time in the same way that Spectrums and N64s did. And also, they would have started executing our code immediately. There's no operating systems or boot ups or anything else in the way. So our code would have just disabled the interrupts and then immediately scanned RAM looking for packets of data. So all of those systems, I'm pretty positive it would have worked on. And no doubt, when people hear this, they'll probably go and try and prove me right or wrong by writing demo code on those systems. And we'll see what happens.
It's Mr. Pants.
Moving beyond Stop and Swap, moving beyond the fabled N64-6, whatever that might actually entail, Microsoft purchased Rare in 2002, and the studio became part of what's now known as Xbox Studios. But when the larger gaming press discusses Rare's output from 2003 up to, let's say, the Kinect Sports trilogy, they usually just focus on the Xbox console games, and even Rare Replay. And I love so many of those. But Rare's handheld team were not only wildly prolific during this era, but contrary to the narrative that a lot of, say, Nintendo partisans have run with, Rare continued to churn out title after title on Nintendo systems up until 2008. 7 GBA games, 2 Nintendo DS games. And there was a lot of wonderful creative talent associated with these games, but you're one of the ones that comes to mind first with this handheld division. And this was a time when the Stampers and others were really complaining about the growing cost and resources needed to make games. I mean, game production was just spiraling out of control at this time. So was there a greater freedom or just less pressure on just focusing on the handheld games during this era?
One of the things I've always found a bit weird about there's rhetoric around handheld devices, particularly in the early days with the Game Boy. People would sort of poo-poo them and go, "Well, that's not a real console, is it?" I never looked at it that way. For me, the Game Boy is a console. It's one you can put in your pocket. It's got fewer colors than some other consoles, but so do some other consoles. You've got fewer colors than some other consoles. So it's just another console, but it's one that gave you the ability to take games away from being tethered to a television in your home. And so I was never daunted with putting a Battletoads game or a DKL game on the Game Boy. I just went, it's a console, so let's go and write a console game. I think there was no reason to actually stop. We already had handheld development. We'd had handheld development since the Game Boy came out. I wasn't even the first person to work on the Game Boy, I don't think. I'm known for it. I think Chris Sutherland was writing The Amazing Spider-Man before Kev and I jumped onto WWF Superstars. But I certainly didn't write the tune routine for Game Boy, so somebody else did. I think it was Chris. So I think he got there first. But when we moved to Microsoft, there were some changes. Obviously, we were going to work on the Xbox platform, and we proved that out the gate by the very first game we released on the Microsoft was actually on GameCube. But then we moved on to Xbox. That one was kind of well baked at that point. It kind of was finished. It had to come out. But there was no reason to stop the handheld teams. I mean, we were releasing handheld games very regularly from about 1990 up until 2008. And we were successful at it. A lot of those games sold very, very well. And there was no reason to stop. Microsoft didn't have competing hardware in that space. So why not carry on? And so we did. And we obviously ported some DKC games. That was the third ports. The third versions of some of those games that we did. The hardware could keep up. I pitched. I became a producer in 2004. So I sort of got involved with those teams. I'd already sort of been helping out teams a little bit for a few years before that while I was still programming on other games. And I became a producer in 2004. I stopped coding at that point. Wow, it's 20 years. And so, I got stuck in with the handheld teams at that point, and we finished off some ports. They also did some original titles, Save Wolf. I really liked Save Wolf. It was a different game from the original Spectrum game. But obviously quite closely related. I thought it was a lot of fun to play. The team did a fantastic job on that one. I also obviously had a hand in a very unique Rare game at that time, which I did finally finish coding. after noodling on it for 5 years, on and off. And so we put that one out briefly. THQ didn't really want to release it, which is why there's so few of them out there. So we did all of that and we carried on. When the DS came along and its increased level of hardware capability, there was no, should we stop writing games on these platforms? We had people that were very good at doing it, and we decided that Diddy Kong Racing would work really, really well on a Nintendo DS. It had different hardware. There were some differences. You had touchscreen, you could blow in the microphone, you can do this, that, or the other with it. And we did make some changes to the game. Some people liked those, some people didn't. I had the idea of being able to design a track. We did it in a very, very restricted fashion. But the idea that, hey, if we just have some standard block track pieces, certain corners, straights, all this sort of thing, and we could use the touchscreen to just draw a basic track. And then I think we had them flying up in the air to avoid having to integrate these simple tracks with landscape and other stuff around them. And just provide players with a new experience around being able to do that, but keep the technology of having to do that as simple as possible so we can deliver something quickly and efficiently. The one I'm most proud of was the last one we did, though, was Viva Pinata, Pocket Paradise, a name that was slightly controversial for a while. Some people thought it was a bit risque because you played with your creatures in your pocket. Anyway, so when we were coming to the end of DKR, we were looking at what was going on with the first VP game, and it's like, that would be perfect on the DS. Because you'd be interacting. You've got a spade. You interact with your garden with a spade and tools and watering cans. And it's like, well, you could do that with a pen on the screen. And then we thought, well, it wouldn't be great if you could navigate through your encyclopedia where everything was iconized, and you just click an icon, it will take you to a page about that. And then all the things you need were icons, and you click through. And then you could swap the screens between the encyclopedia and the main garden backward and forward. And we put the map overview in, and it just worked out brilliantly. And when people ask me what games were my favorite to work on, I have about 3 or 4. And it's not usually something that was the most successful. It was something that was notable about the way it was produced. And for Viva Pinata, we banged through that in 8 months flat, created a load of new stuff. The second Xbox Pinata game was in production at that time, so we nicked some of their new Pinata as well. And then I tried to be evil by making sure only 2 people on the planet would ever see a jelly, but I was downvoted, sadly. So we made it hard, but not as hard as I wanted. I was in evil mode. I was in Battletoads mode. This is a creature you will never be able to achieve. But I loved working on that game. We had a fantastic team. It was just an incredibly smooth production. Horrible technical problems trying to get it onto the hardware. It was very different from the Xbox. I had a hand in designing the interface with the tools and things. And, Gary and Rob and Lee and everybody else, Joe, that was on that team, did just amazing work on that game. And it's one of my favorite projects I've ever worked on.
Obviously, like between the Donkey Kong Country trilogy remakes for the Game Boy Advance and what we call the THQ4 on the Game Boy Advance, the game that you are most known for, the game that you're most associated with, is one of my favorites of all time. It's Mr. Pants. Now, this went through a variety of identities, both behind the scenes and in front of the public, before it actually saw release in late 2004. I believe, Splonge was one of them. Animal Crackers, Donkey Kong Puzzle Paint, Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers, and I think you've even said that after Coconut Crackers, it was briefly considered maybe a Banjo-Kazooie game, like Banjo's Jiggy Juggle. Is that it? But it was announced as Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers at E3 2001. And, unlike Donkey Kong Racing, which had a trailer also shown off at that event, I've never actually mourned the loss of Coconut Crackers, because even as a Donkey Kong guy, first and foremost, I think I recognize its identity was always supposed to be It's Mr. Pants. It seems like just such a a trade up from what it was going to be, but I'm still fascinated by the brief time it spent as coconut crackers. Maybe because we just got that brief taste of it before it was taken away. While I fully recognize this is 23 years in the past, do you have any untold stories or lore about coconut crackers that might surprise the Donkey Kong fans out there?
So Splonge. I know. I think I'm right in saying that Justin Cook, who was involved with it, claimed that it was called that for a while. I have no recollection of that.
Okay.
So Tim did his usual thing. He came to me one day and said, "Hey, Paul, I've got an idea." And he had a bit of paper, and Ian Gregg had been talking about, because Rare had pretty much every genre that existed at that point, except a puzzle game, and obviously Tetris was the king. And he and Greg had been chatting about this, and they came up with a set of rules for a puzzle game. Not many rules. If you play the two-color version of It's Mr. Pants with the red and green blocks, that's pretty much what was on that piece of paper back in 1999. It needed to be a pick-up-and-play pocket puzzler, something to kill time on a bus. So it was going to be on Game Boy. I hadn't obviously looked at the Game Boy. This is 99, so we shipped Donkey Kong Land in the summer of 95. I hadn't looked at the Game Boy in 4 years, but I still had loads of software, source code on my PC. In fact, I probably moved PCs, but somehow got it working. So what I did was I grabbed a copy of the Donkey Kong Land engine, disabled virtually everything. So I just had key scanning routines and some basic stuff for accessing the screen and making some boopy noises. And took this bit of paper. And Tim came to me. It was like just after lunch one day. And about mid-evening, 7 o'clock, I rang him. I said, "Done it." And he said, "Done what?" I said, "I've written a game." He didn't believe me, but he came over to my desk, and I was sitting there playing it, and because the rules are pretty simple. I mean, I don't know. I must have had a time machine or something. I went into a very dark hole for a few hours and came out of it with a perfectly running game, which played all the core rules. The blocks were in there. All the artwork was mine because it had to be. I just banged something out sitting on top of the DKL engine. And we played it, and it was like, oh, it's actually quite fun. So I wrote a game in a few hours. It then took 5 years to actually ship it. So we had this thing. We played it. Tim played it. We liked it. It was fun. I got given a disc with a bit of music on it that Dave Wise had done. And it was from Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. And so I just stuck it in. It was using the standard Game Boy tune routine, so Dave didn't have to do anything weird. He just banged out a tune. So I put it in, and Tim and I were sitting there at the desk one evening, looking at this. We'd been playing it. It was fun. This music was playing over the top of it. And the only question in the air was, what the hell do we do now? Because it didn't look like anything. It was fun. Great. So we got something fun, but it's not a releasable game. I mean, I started writing it earlier today. Okay. So in the end, I just said, why do we call it Nutcracker? It sounds puzzle-ish. It's a puzzle game. It sounds like you're trying to solve a puzzle. We've already got music. I screwed the licensing. We weren't considering that. We're just listening to this lovely tune that David put together. And so it was briefly called Nutcracker for a while. And the reason it took 5 years was because we couldn't work out how to market it. We couldn't work out what to do with it. And that's why I went through so many different phases. I don't remember the Splonge phase. It lives as Nutcracker for a short period of time. At some point, and we needed to move platforms as well at some point. It was originally written, that first version was written on a straight Game Boy, a 1989 grey-green screen Game Boy, because that's what I had sitting on my desk. I was still coding. I was working on other games, doing other things on and off over a period of time. I was helping out, sort of part-time producer with some of the stuff that was going on. So this was something that we'd look at for a bit, put down, go away for a couple of months, come back, look at it again. It wasn't like we were solidly on it. By 2001, and I don't know whose idea this was. It wasn't my idea. Probably Tim and Chris, but somebody said, "Oh, just stick Donkey Kong on it because it'll sell tons." Right. So it was Donkey Kong's Coconut Crackers for ages. We had Donkey Kong there juggling the pieces on the title screen, heavily rendered CGI at that point for what turned out to be a silly puzzle game. That was the version we showed. We'd also moved hardware. It was on the Game Boy Advance at that point. Much more powerful thing. I had to learn to code. It was mostly written in C, but some bits that needed to be quick, I wrote in. I'll be honest with you, I'm a geek. I just wanted to learn assembly language on the 32-bit chip and have all the fun in the world of not having to juggle 8-bit numbers. And it was on an ARM chip, so I had to learn both the thumb and ARM languages, which I relish jumping between because I'm just a geek. So we did that. The main thing about it is because it was on effectively a portable device that was N64 level of technology, we could have a sort of an isometric plane, and we decided to do a 3D version of it where you were looking at this thing on a plane tilted over at an angle, looking at the board that you would put the pieces down on a plane tilted over at an angle. And the problem was that although we did it and we showed it off, and it was pretty with the colors, and we were trying to productionize it, it was really hard to play. The resolution on the screen just wasn't up there, particularly for the squares that were right at the back of the board. And it just didn't play well in that 3D view. And it just wasn't as pretty as it could have been. If we'd had much higher resolution screen, we might have gone with it, but it was awkward. And in the end, we relented and threw out the 3D aspect of it and just went to a straight top-down 2D view. Obviously, though, in September 2002, when we became part of Microsoft, franchises got separated and we didn't have access to writing new DK-related games anymore. So we had to rebrand it again. And it was at that point somebody just went, sod it, stick our mascot on it. Just call it Mr. Pants. Okay. That wasn't my idea. The thing was, at that point, it didn't look like anything. And this is the bit, I mean, I talk about marketing, but the look of the game and that humor in the game wasn't settled yet. We had a gameplay element that we didn't know what to call it. And one day, and this was completely random, a new artist in the studio, a guy called Ryan Stevenson, got a desk next to me. He was working on something else. And he came in one morning and he saw what I was doing on the screen. And he came in one morning and he had a doodle. It was a picture. It was badly drawn, deliberately badly drawn. He did it on purpose. He did it the previous night. And he showed it to me. He said, "Paul, this is what your game should look like." And took one look at it and went, "Yeah, actually, you're right." And I nicked him off whatever he was working on. And in fact, that picture, uncorrupted, exactly in the form that he originally came up with it, is one of the first pictures that you unlock in the gallery.
Oh, really?
But it might even be the first one. And I think it was just a picture of Mr. Pants. Yeah, it was the picture of Mr. Pants with his family. So there was the dog, Mrs. Pie, his wife, a couple of kids. There was a cat. Was it Socks the cat or Socks the dog? I can't remember.
It's Socks the dog and Vest the cat, I think.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
His kid is Toby. I know so much about Mr. Pants lore, Paul. It's disgusting, and I would never be able to use this as a marketable skill other than what I do right here. So thank you for that.
You're most welcome. Anyway, it didn't kill Ryan's career because he's still at the studio today, obviously. He went on to be art director on Sea of Thieves. So he was quite liked for what he did then. But actually, a lot of the humor that went into the game after that was that picture set a tone. It was, how do we make something deliberately bad? How do we make something crass and stupid? There was another idea as well. We privately came up with this idea about Mr. Pants' character, which I can't really publicize because it's not great. he's a bit furtive and weird. So we had an idea at the back of our minds. We sort of, every time we had a conversation about how do we put something in, we tried to subvert it and go left a bit and make it a bit weird and pervy. And we carried on like that. Much of the humor that's actually in the game, it was just Ryan and I riffing off each other, sitting next to each other, just having a laugh. And we were looking at things around us and putting in references to things in life and things in film and music that we liked. There was one of the gallery pictures. Ryan had a planet surface. Mr. Pants was standing there with a goldfish bowl on his head to stop him dying in the lack of atmosphere. And there was a little orange moon around it. And he had a little spaceship, and it looked a bit like the spaceship in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, the space station. And I looked at that, and I just went, "Whoa, hang on a sec, that moon," because he made it dimpled. It was like it was supposed to be cratered, but low resolution, and it just looked a bit like an orange. And I went, "Do you remember those old Flash Gordon series from the 50s? And how rubbish the spaceships were? It looked like there was a little key on the back, spinning around on a little metal thing. Put a key on that and we'll call it a clockwork orange. There's a spaceship from 2001. We'll call the picture Stan's Pants. We put the monolith from 2001, I think, on the planet Earth, the black monolith. And we called it Stan's Pants. And
the monolith with underpants pulled down on
so
top of it. Yes.
Everything has to have pants on it. Even Pants had pants on it at various points. And then some killjoy went, "No, you can't call it Stan's Pants. You've gone far enough. Stanley Kubrick will sue you." And I'm thinking, well, he died 3 years ago, so he might be busy doing other things. And a massive Stanley Kubrick fan. He's just, every work is awesome there. And we homaged him with "It's Mr. Pants" and a gallery reference. So sorry if he's up there. Sorry, we didn't mean to defile your work with ours. But yeah, it was just Ryan and I just having a laugh, and anything that we could do stupid. That's why when levels end and things, cows come flying in, and other things. Right in the last week, because nobody was paying attention to this, they hated the game at Rare. Actually, a few people who got it. Well, okay. So we put out a video after Rare Replay, and people involved are all very proud of it. We are proud of it, really. But nobody was paying any attention to it, including our QA team, I believe. So about 3 days before I shipped the final build, I was looking at it going, everything in this game is mad, and it's out there, except two things that are now really annoying me that I look at them. One was every time you paused the game, it said paused, like every other video game ever written. And I hated it. So I just sat there. Nobody was talking to me about this. Nobody cared. They thought it was probably already shipped and hadn't been noticed, which is ultimately what actually happened. Except for you, your good self, obviously. And sorry for the nightmares we gave you. But so I was looking at this pause going, no, that's rubbish. So I came up with some phrases like Mr. Pants was talking to you, things like "I love you" and "we dream of sheep" or "pants" or something. And I just got it so that the word pause would alternate with these messages because it was just different. I hadn't seen that in a video game before. The other thing that annoyed me was the credits, because it went programming by, design by, and it's like, no, everything else has changed. I'm going to do something different. So I came up with alternative phrases for these. So design was "we dream of pants." Programming was "stitching pants." I can't remember what the others were, but there was one person who I shan't name because I don't want to embarrass her, but she was vaguely attached to the game briefly. And I had to put her in the credits, and I couldn't think what she did that was useful. And she might listen to this, and she'll know who she is. So I'm sorry, so-and-so, for upsetting you. I'll apologize next time I see you. So I listed her as hangers on, because you hang pants on hangers, right? And I couldn't think of anything else. I just went, well, you're loosely associated with the game. So you're a hanger-on. You're like a groupie. So I just changed that. Anyway, I gave the game back to the test department. Nobody picked me up on it. They just went, I can't find any bugs. And it shipped with that in. And nobody ever knew that I did it, except you and the 3 other people that ever bought the game.
Now, to be fair, we've always joked. So "It's Mr. Pants" was released, and I use that term very loosely. We've basically dated it to December of 2004, but it's kind of hard to determine because nobody ever actually encountered a copy in the wild. I always joke and say they only produced 12 cartridges worldwide. But that's obviously just me being a goof. It was probably 15. And I had to get my copy on eBay from a games dealer, I think near the Canadian border. They somehow procured a few copies. So like we at DK Vine, we like quickly bought ours, and like not to put you on a spot, not to gush too much, but what a brilliant game. I weird people out all the time by going on about it, but I legitimately will say it is my favorite puzzle game of all time. Tetris is down here, right? And then It's Mr. Pants is up here. And I say that because I've never gotten into puzzle games until It's Mr. Pants. It just never clicked with me. What I look for in video games is an immersive, like, world building experience, going on an adventure that I could never go on in my day-to-day life. And a puzzle game always just felt very dry. It always felt just academic in a way that made it feel like homework rather than a truly special experience. And then It's Mr. Pants comes out, and it's got, like, being a Rare fan for so many years, for like a decade before it came out, I was already primed for it, but it really does feel like It's Mr. Pants was the most pure, uncut version of that Rare style of humor. Like, you'd finally stop diluting your product, and you're finally giving us the biggest hit imaginable of the essence of Rare. And, you know, like you mentioned the gallery artwork, like unlocking all of that and getting these little glimpses into Mr. Pants's bizarre jet-setting lifestyle, and it really motivated you to want to keep going. And it's the only puzzle game I've ever beaten 100%, gotten all the platinums, muddle mode, like did all of that. I actually beat the mobile edition, the mobile adaptation of it, track that down, also completely beat it because I'm just that obsessed about the game. But you mentioned before, I don't know if it was in the Rare reveal video you did for it, but you mentioned somebody was trying to create a Wikipedia entry for Mr. Pants. And, the basis for the argument was that he was the star of his own video game, like Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog. I mean, it's Mr. Pants. It's there in the title. He deserves his own page. And they kept, taking it down. But I think I've confessed this before, but that was me. I I was the one trying to wage that campaign, unsuccessfully, I might add. But, I will say, even if THQ only made 15 copies of the game and it sold around 6 at launch, we've definitely tried to do our part spreading the word over the last 20 years. DK Vine staffer Cameron Regal and I, we did a panel at MagFest in Washington, D.C. back in January 2020, and we spent a portion of the panel just discussing It's Mr. Pants, and lo and behold, someone in the audience actually bought it during our presentation. So I think maybe by the time we get to its 25th anniversary, we can have all 15 copies sold, which will be a glorious day. But yeah, I think it might be your magnum opus. I think it's, if you're comparing it to Stanley Kubrick, I think it's your Shining or 2001: Space Odyssey. It's just spectacular.
Well, I do appreciate that. I think you're lovely, but you're obviously horribly misguided. So I should set your listeners straight on this. So first of all, I'm not Paul McCartney. It's Mr. Pants is not Tetris, and the character is not Mario, which is why the Wikipedia page, as you have mentioned, the discussion group got locked down because it was starting to get a bit heated about the ridiculousness of it. I actually view that I actually think, and I'm not alone in thinking this, that if you look at what Rare has tried to do over the years and what Rare has stood for, Mr. Pants is up there as being one of the things where that is the most rare, not just in terms of how few copies were made. There are games. I think Viva Pinata is another one. I know Greg thinks Viva Pinata is one of the top things that Rare has ever created. I agree with that. I think it's that ability to go out there, do whatever you want, completely off the wall, crazy stuff. There weren't many meetings on It's Mr. Pants. It was 2 people sitting in a room having a laugh, going, "Oh, let's do that, let's do that," and then, "Oh, that picture hasn't got enough pants on. Where can we screw some pants in?" and everything else. And if you can think of it, and if it made us laugh, we put it in. That was it. I do agree. The funny thing is, when you look at all the people that had any significant contribution on that, I'm still at Rare. Robin Beanland, who did music, is still at Rare. Greg was behind the original gameplay idea with Tim. Greg is still at Rare. In fact, quite a few of the people that were heavily influential on it are still at Rare today. I know Robin has said, Ryan, obviously, well, sorry, Ryan, yes, I did mention Ryan earlier. Yes. So art director on Sea of Thieves, it didn't kill his career. In fact, he was lauded for his work on It's Mr. Pants, because it was creative and it was out there. And it was nothing anybody would have thought of, you know. And Robin has said publicly in a Rare Replay video that it's one of the things he's most proud of having worked on. I agree with him completely. I think it's great. Not everybody gets it. Some people think it's inane and very stupid. It was designed to be. That as professional, experienced game developers doing what we do and being given complete freedom to do it. And we did. And we ran with it as far as we could go. And then THQ screwed it up. They didn't want the game. That gang of four, as you say, they were forced into having all four or none. And I always thought, my recollection was they made 10,000 copies and shipped them to some moose in Canada. So I've been going to the Retromessa retro gaming thing in Norway, which I'm going to plug here. It's great. Go. It's every August. It's brilliant. Jan does a great job of running it. Anyway, I've been going for a few years now. And a couple of years ago, somebody who told me they were a massive Rare fan, they had every game we'd ever made. And I went, "Have you got It's Mr. Pants?" And it's like, "What?" And they got their phone out and they're now looking it up. It's like, "Oh my God, there's a Rare game I haven't got." I said, "You won't get it. It was released a long time ago in Canada and it's now in landfill, and all 3 copies." Last year, that same person came up to me. They had spent ages trying to find a pristine copy of It's Mr. Pants. Got one, brought it in. I signed it. I then told them some other stuff about it. Said, "Well, it was only released in Canada." I was at Retromessa a few weeks ago. They came up to me again and said, no, it was in Europe. Here's a European copy of it. And he showed me what was written on the back. And it's like, oh, yeah, they did release it in Europe as well.
Oh, wow.
The funny thing was, I probably signed more copies of It's Mr. Pants a few weeks ago in Norway than I signed Banjo-Kazooie cartridges, which is unusual because a lot of people come up to me with Banjo cartridges, and some DKL ones as well. And I have no idea where they got them for. But I'll tell you what, if you go on eBay and search for It's Mr. Pants, there's a suspiciously large number of brand new sealed copies. And I'm just wondering if there's still a factory in China somewhere banging them out today. I've got a feeling there's a midnight truck coming out of there with a secret stash of this underground cult classic.
Nobody's told them to stop. They never got the memo. They've just been diligently producing it for 20 years. Yeah.
Well, THQ went, so maybe as you say, the fax didn't get through the factory. Hey, stop already!
I could waste more of your time talking about It's Mr. Pants for literally hours, but we'll wrap things up here. After the end of the handheld division, you've been director of quality at Rare, and you've been doing quality assurance for the Kinect sports games, Sea of Thieves, Battletoads 2020, and I assume Everwild, although you obviously can't speak much to the latter right now. But what's your day-to-day at Rare like these days?
I run several central services teams at Rare. I took on another team a couple of years ago. We've sort of reorganized it into... So it's all very businessy now. I can't believe we just went from Mr. Pants to something corporate. We've reorganized it in a way that we're trying to build out how Rare operates so that we can future-proof us and make sure that we can run with multiple games in release at any one time, and just make Rare a stronger studio than it's ever been. We've obviously had massive success with Sea of Thieves. I won't give you the latest figures. I know we've announced north of 40 million people that have played that, which is unbelievable. We have had lots of very successful moments with that, with the Pirates of the Caribbean, and more recently with the PlayStation launch, which has been very good for us as well. I do a lot of different things. I deal with a lot of different groups at Rare. I try to problem solve and help advise people how to get through gnarly problems. And I will sit over a coffee and give people my war stories about how wonderful production on that game or some other game was a long time ago, to try and put today's problems in context and keep people on an even keel. I'm very much in a build a team, mentor a team, support a team role. We work with some fabulous partners, so I spend a lot of time talking to them, deal with a lot of people in Redmond. I can't get too specific here about some of the stuff that I do. Some of it is problem solving with some not great problems as well. We have a community of people out there, most of whom are fantastic. Some people out there try to cause trouble in our player base, and so we do things there to try and make sure that the masses have as good an experience as possible. And operating a live services game has a lot of challenges, and the thing that keeps me young is I'm surrounded by a ton of very, very talented people every single day, and I still see passion in the studio today that I saw 36 years ago when I walked in there. Everybody wants to create amazing entertainment experiences for people out there, and we've broadened our scope. We're way bigger on accessibility and other things these days, which are incredibly important, and the industry is increasingly moving towards trying to provide a great and even experience for whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever language you speak, or however you need to be able to access the game. And we support a bunch of causes there, and I think Rare's an incredible studio, and I think it's fitting that we're just having incredible success today in the way that we are. Rare will be 40 years old next year.
That's
which
right.
is shocking.
Yeah.
We're nearly a decade down from Rare Replay.
Oh God.
So yeah, I know. Tell me about it. I remember being part of the group of people that were choosing the games that had to fit into Rare Replay. It was going to be 30 games from 30 years for $30. And we were throwing darts at a whiteboard going, that one, but not that one because it wasn't so good, and things like that. Yeah, it's going to be 40 years next year. And what a history. What a history.
While I have you here, in your job duties, could we ever get a Mr. Pants ship set in Sea of Thieves? Because, okay, so like, I have been trying to get TT from Diddy Kong Racing as a ship clock in the game, because when I got to visit Rare in 2016, we got to play the Unity build of Sea of Thieves, and lo and behold, TT was in that build as a ship clock. And, I've been like advocating for that ever since Greg made that public. But one of the things I've always wanted was to have ship sails that are the big red Y-front briefs that Mr. Pants wears. And I can't think of a better inside advocate for such a thing as you. So, yeah, I don't know how much, under the table cash I have to slip you to get that the possibility, but that would be great.
Have you not found all the Mr. Pants references in the game already? I mean, he must be scratched into a few rocks under the sea in some obscure part of the world, surely.
I've looked. I have been on every corner of that map, and I have found every Rare reference, but not Mr. Pants, unfortunately. So, hope springs eternal. I'm not going to give up.
Well, you never know. We might use it as the cherry on the cake for our big birthday next year. You shall have to wait and see.
I will look forward to that. But I want to thank you once again for being here. Like I said, you've been somebody I've been wanting to chat with for a long, long time. And not everyone has the great fortune to be able to have nearly 2 hours worth of chat with someone who's been directly or indirectly responsible for so many of their favorite moments in gaming. And, Donkey Kong Land, it helped me get through some rough stretches of adolescence, and Banjo-Kazooie's conspiracy theories were just one of my favorite summertime memories. And It's Mr. Pants, like I said, it was a touchstone of my young adult years and got me through college and career uncertainty. But one of the great privileges of doing this podcast and running DK Vine is that I do get the chance to interact with so many of the creators that have contributed to the games that I adore. And I just wanted to say that you have provided me, and I know a large part of our audience, so much joy over the years. And it's something I hope you realize and take pride in, even if you don't want to compare yourself to McCartney or Kubrick. It's fine, but you do deserve all of it. Even if I could never get that damned ice key into Banjo-Tooie, I hope you realize what a special career you've had.
Well, I do really appreciate that. I believe there's somebody out there on the internet who's got a Zelda cartridge that might be able to get you that ice key now. Happened about a year ago or so. Yeah, I don't know. I've only ever seen it from the inside. I don't see it from the outside. I was a massive fan of Ultimate Play the Game, which was the predecessor of Rare. And I just remember when those games coming out and I was a teenager, I remember seeing Sable for the first time. I particularly remember seeing Night Owl for the first time. It's like, whoa, what's that? And I said to the person playing it, is that the new Ultimate game? Because for me, it couldn't have been anything else. And, when I left school, I talked earlier about getting games published at school. And, all these companies were offering me jobs. And I was going, well, I'm a child. You can't actually employ me, can you? I privately didn't want to work for them. But I thought to myself, look, arrogantly, if there was anybody I was ever going to work for, it would be Ultimate Play the Game. And then 2 years after I left school, I accidentally joined Rare. So kind of got lucky, I guess. But so, I remember looking at the Ultimate games, and if people have looked at anything that we've done over the years, and there's been, I have no idea, many, many hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 or more people that have worked at Rare. I have no idea. It's nearly 40 years. It's a collective thing that everybody has contributed to. I'm here today having a chat. I know you've spoken to other people. You'll speak to other people again in the future. It's a collective team effort. Everything everybody does. There's hundreds of people working on Sea of Thieves today. And that's been, as I say, very, very successful for us. I appreciate your comments. I'm definitely not Paul McCartney. And we haven't invented Mario or Tetris. So just get those facts straight. Okay, I'm going to get those out there so that nobody can dispute that.
This has been a File 2 production.
Que rico.